Welcome to the Heartland Institute special briefing on reining in governors run amok. I'm Jim Lakely, Vice President of the Heartland Institute, and you are in for a very informative program this afternoon. Thank you for joining us. If any governor had dreams of being king for a day, we've learned that COVID-19 has offered them the perfect excuse to make that dream come true. And all of the liberties that we took for granted just a few months ago have been swept away in the process. None of us signed up for this. When this COVID crisis hit, Americans all across the country started socially distancing before they were ordered to do so. That is because Americans, as individuals and as a people, are reasonable and will do their part in a crisis voluntarily. But many governors started acting unreasonably, and things quickly got out of hand. The freedom to worship at church, even in your car in a parking lot at Easter, was taken away in some places. The freedom to assemble in a park or on a beach in the open air where it's the healthiest, that was taken away. The freedom to go to work, even if practicing sensible social distancing practices with employees who volunteer to come in, was abridged. Governors didn't trust American employers to do the right thing for their employees, and their decisions on workplace freedom was arbitrary. The florist was closed, but you could get flowers at the grocery store. The pharmacy was open, but the hospital might have been closed to you if you needed cancer treatment. Again, nobody signed up for this. We all got behind 15 days to stop the spread, to flatten the curve, so our hospitals, doctors, and nurses wouldn't be overrun by a flood of COVID-positive patients. We reached that goal. We did it. But lockdown governors kept moving the goalposts. It turned into a permanent lockdown to keep everyone safe, whatever that means, because it's never really defined. Many governors simply declared that they would award some of our liberty back to us, but on their schedule. There was no real plan. There's no real timeline. All of this is arbitrary, and it's not based on science. The constituents in your states need you to stand up for them. They need you to start reining in these emergency powers that none of us could have dreamed would be so abused so awfully and so blatantly. You have to make sure that a governor's dream of being king for a day turns into no more than king for 30 days, at best, at least without the input of the representatives of millions of powerless people who are watching their lives and businesses be destroyed and have no way to resist without resorting to lawlessness. This can't happen again. Thank you for indulging my laments on this. So believe me, you got off easy. I've been ranting to Heartland staff for weeks with increasing anger, especially here in Illinois, but it's an anger all freedom-loving people share. I will now hand it over to someone you are all familiar with, Heartland Institute Government Relations Director Cameron Schulte, to take you through the program and introduce the excellent lineup of speakers we have to discuss this important issue today. Cameron?
Thank you, Jim. I'm Cameron Schulte, Director of Government Relations here at the Heartland Institute. As you know, the Heartland Institute has been advocating for individual liberty and free markets for nearly 40 years. Through our programs and research, we felt we were in a unique position to bring lawmakers and opinion leaders together today to begin a conversation on how to rein in governors run amok and claw back legislative involvement in states' responses to the coronavirus pandemic as a co-equal branch of government. Over the next hour, you will hear from a legal expert, a local government official, and a former state lawmaker as they give their perspective on what is happening in their states, what they see happening in other states, and what they see as good policy moving forward. Some states have had tremendous success in managing the government response to the pandemic, while others' responses have been haphazard and seemingly without rhyme or reason. Yet, in nearly all cases, the governors have acted with little to no input from the legislative branch. And as the elected representatives from your communities, you have an obligation to be involved in those decisions, to be fully aware of the process and rules being instituted, and to be engaged while the public and the economy remains unsettled. The governors of Illinois and New York have given us good examples of how this power grab and unitary action costs lives, and it decimates a state's economy, while states like Florida, Georgia, and North Dakota have given us good models to review and managing and reopening the state. Just this morning, we learned that the Illinois Governor Pritzker is spending time in Wisconsin, presumably because it's not Illinois. As a Wisconsinite, I welcome the governor as we welcome Dan Rostenkowski, George Ryan, and Rod Blagojevich before him. In Wisconsin, a recent state Supreme Court decision overturned an extension of Governor Evers' safer-at-home order. Our first panelist, Rick Esenberg, is President and General Counsel of the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, a free market policy and legal center in Milwaukee. Will filed an amicus brief in the recent Supreme Court case, Wisconsin Legislature v. Palm, challenging the constitutionality of Secretary-designee Palm's order to extend the state's safer at home policy to May 26th. Our second panelist is Waukesha County Executive Paul Farrow, also in Wisconsin. Some of you may be familiar with crucial Waukesha County, as national media outlets call it, because of its role in determining Wisconsin's statewide elections and hence the nation's elections. County Executive Farrow is also a former state assemblyman and state senator, and he will provide his perspective on the balance between state and local policy approaches to emergency orders. Our third panelist is Bette, a former state representative from North Dakota, a policy fellow at Heartland, and current president of the Heartland Institute, North Dakota's state-based free market think tank. She will share the North Dakota experience with coronavirus and how her state has navigated the pandemic. After that, we'll move to a brief discussion on the next steps Heartland intends to take to research and develop a model for legislators to rein in emergency powers and to claw back their role as a co-equal branch of government. And lastly, we'll move to Q&A. Thank you again for joining us this afternoon. Rick Esenberg, let's start with you.
Wisconsin had a typical stay-at-home order. Right? It began with an order to everyone in the state of Wisconsin to stay home, and then listed a variety of exceptions for when you could venture out and close non-essential businesses, and it was generally of a type with those that have been issued across the country. Wisconsin is the first state to have ended that order through litigation. But that litigation was not the typical assertion of individual constitutional rights that we would have otherwise expected it to be, but it was something that was initiated by the legislature and that was focused on limitations on the structure of government and the process that needed to be followed in order to put these orders in place. In other words, Wisconsin legislature versus Palm was not about what a stay-at-home order should provide for. It was about how you go about putting one in place. Here's what happened. In early March, Governor Tony Evers declared a public health emergency. About 10 days later, pursuant to that public health emergency, he issued a safer at home order, which essentially locked down the state. Under Wisconsin law, a public health emergency is time limited. It can only stay in place for 60 days. It can be rescinded at any time by a joint resolution of the legislature, and it can be extended for another 60 days only by a joint resolution of the legislature. So as we got into mid-April and the governor decided that he wanted to extend the order past the 60-day expiration of the public health emergency, which would have been May 12th, he decided to rely on a different statutory provision. He discovered, he thought, that Chapter 252 of the Wisconsin statutes, which empowers the Department of Health Services to take broad steps to control infectious disease, could operate as a back door that would allow him to evade this 60-day limit and essentially order his acting secretary of Department of Health Services to extend his safer at home order past the 60 days and in fact to do so indefinitely. And that's what happened. He directed her to extend the order. And then a couple of days later, she issued what was called the Badger Bounce Back Order. And the Badger Bounce Back Order set forth a variety of gating criteria and core responsibilities that would have permitted Wisconsin to reopen. And without getting into detail, if you look at those, it became very clear that Wisconsin wasn't going to reopen until the governor wanted it to, and that it was unlikely at the time that it would be very soon. We put out a paper a couple of days after that stay-at-home order was extended, pointing out that this created a very anomalous situation. It created a situation in which a single cabinet officer actually had the sole power to lock down the state indefinitely, free of the time limits that state law would impose on the governor's choice to do so. And we suggested a number of reasons why the law should not be read that way. And we suggested that if it were to be read that way, it would, in all likelihood, be an unconstitutional violation of our separation of powers in the state constitution. The legislature came to the same conclusion, and it filed a lawsuit. It filed what's called an original action in the Wisconsin Supreme Court, so the case didn't have to work its way up through the lower courts. It essentially made two arguments. The first was that Chapter 252, this statute that empowered the Department of Health Services to take steps to control infectious disease, required the Secretary of DHS to proceed by rulemaking when issuing an order of general applicability, right? And so in this case, where what the Secretary had done is essentially ordered people to stay home, subject to certain exceptions, ordered certain businesses to close down, ordered certain travel to not take place, all punishable by criminal penalties, that this really constituted the making of a rule under state law, and she couldn't simply decree it. She had to go through the rulemaking process, which, as you know, would involve public notice, comment. It would involve legislative oversight. A joint committee of the state legislature could block the rule if it wants. And so its argument was, if you're going to do this, you have to proceed by rule. The other argument that it made is that this broad grant of authority under Chapter 252, which basically say take steps, to control infectious disease or close public gatherings, had to be read narrowly. That it could not be read to authorize these safer at home orders, which do not focus on persons who are infected or expected to be infected, but essentially start with the presumption that all human contact should be minimized and that we should only provide exceptions for that, which we can't realistically prevent. The Wisconsin Supreme Court, by a vote of 4-3, agreed with the state legislature and ordered that the Secretary of Health Services had to proceed by rulemaking, and also held that the safer at home order that existed in Wisconsin was too broad, that it could not order people to stay at their homes. It could not be in all private gatherings. It could not forbid all but so-called essential travel, and it could not close all but so-called non-essential businesses. It had to be something that was more narrow and more directly targeted. Now, the court didn't say precisely where the line was to be drawn. It simply concluded that the Wisconsin safer at home order, which is typical of safer at home orders that have been issued across the state, went too far. The legislature had done an interesting thing when it filed the lawsuit. It had asked the court to declare that the safer at home order was unlawful, but it also asked the court to stay the effective date of its order for 6 days so the secretary could promulgate a emergency rule that the legislature would then review and decide whether to suspend or not suspend. And I think it did that in part as a matter of litigation strategy. It really didn't want to ask the justices to be the ones that lifted restrictions. It also may have done that as part of what might have been, at the time, assumed to be a negotiating strategy so they could sit down with the governor and work something out. The court declined to do that. It said that if an order is unlawful, an order is unlawful. And so as of April or May 13th, when the decision was issued about not just a little less than a week ago, Wisconsin had no safer at home order in place. It's an interesting strategy. It doesn't put the courts in charge. It asks the courts to facilitate legislative input. And whether or not it is available in your state will, of course, depend on your state law. But one of the things that we did in the case is we filed an amicus brief and we said, look, if you can, in fact, interpret Chapter 252 to put this type of authority in one set of hands, be it the governor, be it a cabinet secretary, that would allow one person to say, I am going to lock down the state indefinitely and punish someone with criminal law if they don't abide by my order, that essentially constitutes legislating. And that it violates the vesting of legislative authority, in our case, in the Senate and the Assembly, but I think in every state constitution that I know of, there is a separation of power. There is a vesting of the legislative authority in the legislature. And while I think it would be futile to say that the legislature may not authorize the governor to act in an emergency, to give the governor that 60 days in order to respond to an unfolding pandemic, that to do it for longer than that is an unconstitutional delegation of legislative authority. And I think that argument probably works in a number of different states. It's a tough argument. Courts have been very reluctant to police delegations of legislative authority. But the point behind it is that our separation of powers are a liberty-enhancing device. They're a way to facilitate input into policymaking process, and the legislature can't waive it. It cannot give its authority away to the governor. And so I think this type of litigation may work in other states. There was a case in Oregon yesterday in which a lower court judge said that the governor's safer at home order was invalid because it had gone on for longer than 30 days without legislative approval. It's an interesting, it's a very, very interesting strategy. Of course, what it does is it returns authority to the legislature. What's happened in Wisconsin, which we maybe can talk about later, is that the ball is now back in the hands of the political branches. And we can talk later about what it is that they've been doing with it.
All right, thank you, Rick. I'm going to now throw it over to Paul Farrow, Waukesha County Executive Paul Farrow in Wisconsin for his thoughts.
Thanks, Cameron. And thanks, Jim, for having me on for this opportunity. It's unique when I listen to Rick, I watch him and what Will has done for us throughout the years, really moving a good conservative understanding and motion forward. We were watching this impatiently the last week and a half as the court was deciding what they were going to do. And as a good executive, I was sitting here going, okay, I've got three things in front of me. Is the court going to say the governor's in check and this is what we're going to do? The court's going to say it's got to go back to the legislature, like Rick was saying, and we're going to do this. Or the nuclear option is, okay, counties, have fun. We're going to see you later and good luck with this. And that's what ended up happening. As most of you know, the pandemic's been around. It's been impacted in many different ways. When I look at what has happened here in Waukesha County, I want to give you kind of a picture. I know Cameron said we're, the linchpin for a number of different reasons, but Waukesha County is the third largest county in the state. We have a population of about 405,000 people. Milwaukee is just to the east of us with just over 960. Dane County is number 2 at about 565. It's important to keep that in mind because when you look at proximity, you'd think this is going to impact our county pretty harshly. When this started off back in March and we had the declaration here, our focus right away is what counties are supposed to do and what they do best is emergency management. We went in and looked at the situation and said, okay, how do we make sure that we reduce the spread as much as possible? That was keeping the highest at risk populations isolated or quarantined, and then really start working on the follow through of what's happening with the test cases, especially the positive cases. You hear a lot about the term contact tracing. We took it to heart. The goal was to have the contact tracer make first call within 24 hours. Towards the beginning of April, we were just about a day and a half out. Very quickly, we were able to get it under 12 hours. So we sit down today and we talk about the impact to the county. I look at numbers like this, and you've heard them from wherever you may live, but Wisconsin has 12,000 total cases. Waukesha County has 485 total cases. As someone who's focused on outcomes, total cases don't mean a thing to me. That's an aggregate number that has occurred since March 10th. The number that's important to us is our active cases, which is 107. And so when we look at what the impact is on our healthcare providers, that's the number we're worried about. Talking with them, typically about 30% of those cases have been hospitalized at one point or another. So now you're talking only about 35 people are in our hospitals. That's what our responsibility is. When I look at the county, we're a partner in this. Partner with business, partner with the community. Our charge is to keep the public safe. And to do that, we want to make sure our healthcare systems are never overburdened. Early on, that was a challenge. And I say the Safer at Home was a great opportunity for us to take a deep breath, find out what's happening, get a picture, and now know what we have to do to move forward. And that's what we've done. When the order came down on May 13th, my cabinet and I had a discussion late in the evening to talk about what orders are we going to put in place. And I said, you guys, there's no reason to put in order. What we're doing is telling people we have to be smart, we have to be vigilant, but at the same time, we've got to get back to doing what we all do best, and that's live our lives. And in my case, that's businesses. When you look at the impact, and this is one of the things that a lot of people have a disconnect on, probably except for this world, if it wasn't for business, government wouldn't be here. If it wasn't for the taxes that we're collecting, we wouldn't have the opportunity to serve. And so if we keep shutting that down, sooner or later, it's going to come back on us. And as we've seen at the national level, they're willing to write checks out of the checkbook that they don't have a balance in. We don't do that in Waukesha County. In fact, I'm proud to say that we have a AAA bond rating and have had it for the last 20 plus years because we're very frugal and very concerned about our fiscal opportunity. The county's unique. We don't have a sales tax. So as we go through this issue right now, we're not seeing a whole lot of impact because our team has put some great structures in place to be able to move that forward. And I think that's one of the things that we constantly look back at as I move forward now into this end of May, coming into Memorial Day weekend. A lot of the questions we've been getting from businesses and from entities is, where's the plan? What do we do? What do we do next? And I keep telling them, you guys, you know how to run your business better than I do. I was a small business owner. I had a home inspection company. I knew how to run that, but I didn't know how to run a construction company. And so why would I, as a county executive, want to tell these different companies and all the different sectors we have what you need to do and how I should micromanage you in operating your business? We know what it means to keep people safe. I think there are guidelines that are out there. The CDC has got some great guidelines. Our Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation created wonderful guidelines for businesses to look at how they need to stay open and what they need to do to keep their employees and their customers safe. They don't need an order for that. And I think that's the difference that we have is I'm not here to tell you what to do. I'm here to partner with you to be successful. And the mindset that I've used ever since I got into this position has been very effective for us in the county, and we'll continue to do so. Now, we're going to keep an eye on what's going on. I was able to tell you the numbers because we constantly look at it, and we're in constant conversation with our healthcare providers on a daily basis to make sure there isn't an overburden. If there gets to a point where, for some reason, there might be a flare-up, there might be a sudden increase in our cases, yeah, then we go back to doing what we do, and we put out a warning to people saying we're getting to a point where our hospitals are being burdened, and we may have to put a shutdown in place. But it's not going to be a clampdown for 7 weeks. When you think about it, the 2-week window is what everyone talks about because we know that's the symptomatic time frame that people have. So let's do 2 weeks. We still have our gating structure. We have been green lighted now for a week and a half. We're still continuing through. Our recommendation is that our groups of greater than 50 shouldn't occur yet. It's a recommendation, but a lot of people are following that, and we'll continue to move forward with it. But that's the key, is we're not here to tell you what to do. We're here to help you be successful. And when government takes that approach, that's when it's the most effective in what it does. well, I would look at a daily basis watching what the state is doing, and I know Rick had kind of alluded to it. The legislature is kind of taking a hands-off approach, saying, okay, let's see what happens with the counties. I'm all for that. Our county is a lot different than Milwaukee County. It's a lot different than Dane County, and when you look across Wisconsin, the 72 counties we have, the overall majority have had fewer than 10 cases. They can open up. And one of the main reasons is when you go to northern Wisconsin and you have it in southern Illinois, social distancing is really easy when you have farms. And when people are living on their farms and they're working, they go into town, they'll know how to stay apart from each other. I don't need to dictate that to them. And I think that's the case that we're going to be setting up now to show people, you know what, if you trust the people of the county, if you trust the people of Wisconsin to do the right thing, the majority will. There'll still be some in the minority who decide they can know better than anybody else and are going to get out there and do whatever they want to do. But the majority is going to come through. We never saw it, and I think Rick will attest, when the Supreme Court ruled, they didn't rule that the COVID virus is gone. What they ruled is that we're going to empower the people to do the right thing to move forward. We know the virus is going to be here. As a county, we'll continue to watch it. We'll continue to maintain the public health department. We'll track down the cases to make sure we keep an eye on where flare-ups might occur and let the community know this is what's happening. On a daily basis, we've got the website put up, and if you look at our dashboard, at a Waukesha County dashboard, we have taken the total case number off the dashboard. We put up another number that's just as important. That's the unemployment number. We have about 19,000 people that have lost their jobs in Waukesha County. Over 500,000 have lost their jobs in Wisconsin. That is a larger impact right now that we're seeing overall comparative to the number of test positive cases of COVID virus. And it's going to have a longer impact on our state and our economy than the virus will. And so that's why we put it on the page, because this isn't just a health issue now, this is an economic crisis as well. And as the emergency operations, we saw that almost 2 weeks into this and created a team that was focused on how do we start looking at the economic recovery. Last week, we had a virtual fair that had almost 1,000 people participate in it, and I think it had 250 businesses participate in it. It was successful, and I know we're going to be working on another one later this summer. Those are the things that government's designed to do, is to assist where we can. And then, as I always say, and Cameron knows it well, then we get out of the way and let business do what business does best, and that's be profitable and make the economy strong. So that's what we've been working on in the county. And as we go along, I'll be happy to answer questions as we go on a little bit further down the show.
Thank you, County Executive Farrow. With that, we'll go right to Bette Grandi.
Thank you, Cameron. What I would like to just kind of start with is a little bit of North Dakota's approach. A background piece is that in February, where we weren't seeing this in the United States, but as this COVID-19 was beginning to move across the world, Saudi Arabia and Russia decided to get into a price war with oil. And with the Bakken and North Dakota being the #2 producer in the nation, it affected us greatly with the big downturn in the grade price of the Bakken oil, stalling and causing great amounts of layoff and unemployment. So before all of this happened, our unemployment just started to skyrocket. North Dakota had been hovering at literally 2 to 3% unemployment. If you can imagine it, it's unheard of, but that's where we were at. We needed thousands of people to move here to fill our open jobs of all sectors, not just oil. And so that was what was on the books. And then this all comes in. So then all of a sudden we hit March 13, Governor Burgum comes in and shuts down the economy with the orders of the health clubs have to close, businesses, bars, the bars, restaurants, personal care, and the social distancing essence of things. So we're now to that phase of you can drive up to get food, you can do takeout, there's some delivery, but we're seeing great unemployment rates. Just all of a sudden, boom, it is just over the top. We went from 2 to 3% to now 17% unemployment. And, you know, in some states, those aren't big numbers, but when you're dealing with a small population and stuff, that's a lot of numbers. And so by March 27th, he moved the personal care businesses, the direct contact businesses, to full shutdown. So now your beauticians, your barbers, everybody, they're done. And many of those, as you all know, they work by sales in their chair. So that means no employment, no money coming in, a great suffering kind of takes place. So everybody thinks North Dakota did it so great because we all talked about facts, not fear. Our governor's great with his words, with things like that. He talked about North Dakota smart. And just like Wisconsin was just saying, absolutely right. North Dakota knows how to social distance. Trust me, there's nobody close by, right? We're all used to being apart. It's not that big a deal. We still have counties that never have been affected by this. So it's difficult for a large portion of our state to having faced all of this and having to deal with it when there are no cases for 50 miles around. I mean, and you're still told you can't go do things and you can't have your business open. And with that, what was kind of interesting is some of our rural bar owners, and think of it not just as a bar owner, but that's the only restaurant in town too. And so they stayed open and they faced the fines and stuff. But for the most part, as far as I know, no one has been fined. They've been told, got to have everybody leave, and then kind of how it's gone. But that type of thing. Now, North Dakota, the reason why we're seen as having done such a good job, here's the deal. Each of the states were kind of given a model. There was a model of, you guys are looking at, and North Dakota was predicted to have over 2,000 people be hospitalized. Well, that would be a little overwhelming for us. How many did we have? Currently 32. Never had more than 1% of people hospitalized in the state. Never more than 1% of the capacity. I'll mind you that. Because the difference was we have in North Dakota, there were initially 2,500 beds available in the hospitals. We built out during this time to have a bed capacity of 3,000, with another 2,000 emergency beds being available inside, like the domes or university gymnasiums and stuff. So we had all the capacity in the world if this would have been an actual disaster. Never happened. Never happened. So our governor in that point kept saying, let's stick to facts, not fear, and he started the reopening process. People in Cass County, the highest populated county in the state, have been a little more reluctant, a little slower to return back to the restaurants. The gyms are open. The cycle bar, that's the big one for people in my family. She's gone from 40 in the class to 15, but running more classes. They're doing what they have to do to, do what's called the smart restart of North Dakota. And things like that are taking place. And I think overall people are getting back to work. The big problem that I see in all of this is that when the governor can force a private business to close at any time for any reason like that. And I think that's where our governor is facing lawsuits for this. We have beauticians and a few others that were totally told to shut down that are in a lawsuit right now in North Dakota for that. And we'll see how that goes. That I think was really critical. The big piece to all of this is we have to, I think, in every state, be really careful on the modeling predictions, and that we can't lay all of our money on the table on those modeling predictions, especially now that we know how wrong they really were. And because that's what they used against people to be able to close down businesses, cut back, to do all these different things, and to force us to, sacrifice freedoms. The whole thing of the fact that we so freely as a nation gave up our freedoms and liberties is really disheartening to me. I think we're seeing enough backlash that we won't let it happen again. Maybe that's just because I'm the optimist. The glass is always half full. It's never half empty in my world. But with this, we were always told you were free to move around. You were free to go shopping. You were free to get meet your needs, do your thing. But we were free to move, but we were not free to work. And that's one of the things that I get frustrated with the federal government and these big spending packages that have come out. When they did the unemployment packages and then gave the bonuses on it, and then they paid out more than what you made when you were at your work, what we're finding in Fargo is they have not been able to get people to come back to work in the hospitality industry, because when they all show up, they turn around and they say, $15 an hour or we're not staying. We're going back to work. We're not coming back to work. And so there's all those kinds of issues. And we can talk more about that as we go to some Q&A. So thank you, Cameron.
Thanks, Betty. I'm going to jump real quick out of order. There's one question, and one of our participants has to jump off here shortly, and there's one question that I wanted to get to. So I'm going to ask him that question, then we're going to get back into the regular order I wanted to go with. And the question's for Rick Esenberg. What do you see as the outstanding legal questions and process in Wisconsin? And do you think that they could apply to other states?
Well, sure. So Wisconsin now has no statewide order. There are a number of counties that have adopted orders under another provision of the law, which gives authority to local officials to take steps to control infectious disease. And there's an outstanding legal issue as to whether or not those orders go too far. Remember I said that the court had said that simply giving someone the power to control infectious disease doesn't mean they can put people on house arrest and close non-essential businesses. And that language that the court narrowly interpreted not to permit such broad restrictions is very similar to the language that applies to local officials. So it's not clear that local officials can go that far either. So that's one legal issue that will be present in Wisconsin. And given the fact that many states have similar types of statutory provisions, I think it would be one that would be repeated elsewhere. The other thing is, I said at the outset that this was not a case about individual constitutional rights. That doesn't mean that individual constitutional rights are not implicated. It simply means that that wasn't the issue in this case. I think initially, most state-based litigation groups and think tanks like my own we're very reluctant to jump into the fray because there's a long tradition in American law of at least giving the government some time to respond to, pandemics and threats of infectious disease. And so I thought initially that, if you filed a lawsuit, claiming free speech rights, claiming infringement on the free exercise of religion, economic liberty, which is a very, very tough thing to do because the courts don't provide much protection for it, that you would have some kind of a balancing test. Maybe it would be a really strict balancing test if it was an infringement on religious liberty or the right to worship, maybe less so if it was just the claimed right to open your business, but that you'd quickly get into the epidemiology of the matter. And at least at the outset, courts were not going to get into that because, as Bette pointed out, we were all having the bejesus scared out of us through these models, right? The models were very, very frightening, the Imperial College model. But now, as time has gone on, we've seen that these models are basically not doing really well. So in Wisconsin, the model that the governor relied on was some John Hopkins modeling, which basically said that even with the safer at home order, right? This is not if we did nothing, but with the safer at home order, that model projected that we would have by May 1st, 2,100 deaths and 13,000, a little less than 12,000 actually hospitalizations by May 1st. In fact, we had about 1,500 hospitalizations and 300 deaths. So the model didn't perform very well. And so I think as time goes on and there isn't a sense of crisis, courts will be increasingly willing to consider these claims. And I think as a result of that, you're going to see more of them asserted. And of course, all of this will be affected by the situation on the ground. I mean, in Wisconsin, basically what happened is the legislature decided that it didn't have a plan and it wasn't going to, they couldn't agree on a plan and they weren't going to have a statewide plan. And then the governor, he was going to promulgate a rule, but he decided the legislature would never approve it. And so he withdrew his proposal for a rule. And so basically everything is, as Paul pointed out, put down to the county level. And that's where we stand right now. And I think it will remain that way unless, there's a significant spike in cases. The situation on the ground can always change these things.
Thanks, Rick. All right, here's what I wanted to bring, why we decided to bring this together today. What we're going to be working on at the Heartland Institute, and we've already started some research into some of the states, and we're going to expand it and possibly do a 50-state look for legislators who are interested, is in the wake of pandemic, what we'd like to do is start crafting that model policy that reins in the governors. So for example, it appears based off our early research is that it's going to be a 30-day, that most emergency powers are a 30-day long order, at which point they need to be controlled or repealed or extended by the legislature. And then the legislatures, most legislatures have a process by which rules are implemented, agency rules are implemented. What we don't want to see is these open-ended orders that go on in perpetuity. So what we want to do is work with the legislators on this call and the ones we work with in other states as well that weren't able to make the call, is take a look at that state's particular statute and say, and craft that policy that's going to control what the governors can do. Like I mentioned earlier, we have a good model in Illinois of what it ought not to look like. We have a model in New York of what it ought not to look like. But then if you look at a state where, such as Florida, while Governor DeSantis has done a nice job opening his state up, it should not be left solely in the hands of the state of the governor, but we want to restore some of that legislative authority. so that's kind of what was the impetus for this, and what the research and what our next project is going to be at the Heartland Institute. So with that, I'm actually going to then move into a second question for County Executive Farrow. Let me pull up that question that came up earlier. Paul, do you think the state or locals should have the primary role for reopening? That is, if Dane County wants to close and Waukesha County wants to reopen, should they be able to make that decision? Or do you think the decision should be guided by state lawmakers or executives?
There's a simple question. When you think about it, it really kind of think is a twofold. When I look at the broad picture, if I look at, again, back in March 13th, when I declared the emergency for Waukesha County, we had no idea what we were dealing with. We knew nothing about what this pandemic could be, the impact. We had some ideas that was going around the rest of the country and the world. We knew kind of parameters, but like both Bette and Rick said, we were thinking worst case scenario, and we didn't even get to mid-case scenario when it came to the impact. So when I look at reopening, different mindset in Waukesha County than Milwaukee County right next to me. Milwaukee County is the largest county we have. They're keeping everything shut down. In fact, their mayor, Mayor Barrett from the city of Milwaukee, was on his press conference yesterday telling businesses, you know, if you guys open up, I'd hate to be you when it comes around to getting your license renewed next year. I mean, that's a blatant misuse of power. It's not you get to decide when a business is open, are they properly working within the parameters? And I think that's the challenge when you start piecemealing things together. What I would say, instead of who should make the decision, Cameron, is we should be together working on this. You know, when you think about most businesses that are out there and the large businesses that I'm in contact in Waukesha County and across the area, we're decision oriented, business driven by outcomes. And so as this process has been going through, when we started out on March 13th, we started a 48-hour rule. What do we have to get done in the next 24 hours? What do we have to do in the next 48? One of those was activate our emergency operations system. Once we got that activated, my charge then was, you guys take 24-48. My responsibility is 5-7. 5 to 7 days out. What do I have to prepare in the county? We shut down county operations. We had to move people to telecommuting, just like a lot of businesses did, and start working that way through. As that got there and our policing team got in place, then I was looking 2 weeks out. And that's where we started looking at economic recovery. That's how businesses function. And then what we do is we have a check-in and we do a debrief and say, okay, are we doing everything right? Are we hitting anything? Is something small falling through the cracks? Is the information we're getting the right information we need? That is what I don't think the governor did. And unfortunately, we reached out on a number of occasions to try to say, here's what we're seeing, here's what we really need. This stuff over here isn't necessary right now. And we never got any input or feedback. That would be my focus as I'm moving forward. If I'm looking at, from a legislative mindset, there's got to be check-ins. We declare emergencies for many different reasons. Tornadoes, natural disasters, we can see it, we know it, we fix it, we move on. When you're dealing with a pandemic that is invisible and you still really aren't sure, the worst thing that the leader can say is, well, we're not going to do anything until we have a cure. Because I don't know about you guys, but we haven't cured much of anything other than polio, and there are some. But the flus, we've got vaccines that hopefully will work this year when you get stuck in the arm. It's not a true cure. And to say that that's what our opening gateway is, makes everybody kind of think, okay, then why are we doing all of this? The last thing that we should be doing as leaders is giving people no sense of hope. When I was in the legislature and when I'm in the position I'm in now, my charge for businesses was to provide a certainty, an atmosphere of what they could do to move forward. And that's what we're working on right now. Bette was talking about what the campaign was in North Dakota. We are kicking off a campaign in Waukesha County that is basically real simple. Stay safe so we can stay open. And what does that mean and what does it look like? It's the CDC guidelines. It's getting businesses to get buy-in and getting the community to understand that, you know what, we're responsible adults. It's time we act like that and we move forward. And I think that's, for me, again, as you're saying, who's in charge of it? I'll take the charge because as a leader, I know I've got a team that I can trust and I can move forward with. And if we make a mistake, we'll correct it and we'll move forward. If I can get the legislature and I can get the governor to do the same thing at the state level, I think it's better because a more consistent approach across the entire state is more conducive, especially when there's so much traveling that goes on. I mean, half the people that live in Waukesha County work in Milwaukee County. Right now, they can't go over there to their offices because they're still shut down. That reduces that impact to all those local companies and restaurants and organizations that are in Milwaukee that aren't seeing their people. That's the only hook when we're doing it at a local level. But then again, as a good local leader, I'm reaching out to the region around me, the 6 counties that I touch, and say, okay, how do we work together and what can we do? And that's what we continue to work on.
Thanks, Paul. Rick, if you've got a moment, I want to get to a question that came up from State Representative Kim Koppelman in North Dakota. He writes, separation of powers violations have been some of his primary concerns. In North Dakota, he noticed they've since formed a committee within the majority caucus to formulate legislation which will need to be introduced in order to respond regarding freedom of religion issues. Those would otherwise seemingly be slam dunk cases, yes, and where it's unclear, does legislation need to be passed?
Well, it depends. So if you look at the protection provided for religious liberty for the federal Constitution, there are 2 types of claims you can make. One, you can say churches are being treated differently than other organizations, and there's an argument that can be made here because you have essential businesses which basically are entitled to do unlimited operation. You can have churches in a lot of these safer at home orders can have only less than 10 people present, although they're now starting to lighten up on some of those restrictions. So you can focus on the discrimination. Under federal constitutional law, it's very difficult if you don't have that kind of discrimination, or if the government is able to say, well, it's different. At church, people are there longer. They speak, they sing. It presents more of a risk. There's a reason to treat them differently. Under federal constitutional law, you may have a difficult time with that type of litigation because a neutral law of general applicability is not unconstitutional simply because it burdens religious practice. There are some states that have a more robust protection of religious liberty. The Wisconsin Constitution is one of those. If you burden a religious practice, it has to be necessary to serve a compelling interest, and it has to be narrowly tailored. And so if you're in a state where you don't have that type of robust protection, then the passage of a law like that might make some sense. And some of them have been passed in a variety of states. They call them Little Freedom Restoration Acts, and that can be something that could be worthwhile to do.
All right, thanks, Rick. Here's a question for Bette that I wanted to get to, and that was, let me move things around. As a former lawmaker, what do you see as the prospect for lawmakers clawing back authority over emergency powers in the states? And then kind of added to that, what are the political prospects for pursuing such legislation?
I think that's really a great question in that a couple of things, and I'll touch on what Representative Koppelman was asking. I have actually been working with a group of religious leaders in North Dakota that are requesting that our governor meet with them to start working on particular guidelines and the issue within how he was handling things in North Dakota with the religious community. And so Kim, you and I can catch back with that a little bit later. One of the things that is important with a lot of these types of things is the wording. And so when they say, you know, you're free to move around, you're free to do these things, the problem comes when the governor, and I've heard the president and others make these statements, is that they'll go, you know, go to the grocery store if you need to, but, you know, just be careful, because if you're the one who makes someone sick, and we find this out through the contact tracing, aren't you gonna feel bad? They throw this guilt onto the top of people to bring fear of wanting to get back to life. And so that's what happened in the church communities here in North Dakota, and I know probably happened elsewhere. They were free to meet at any time. They were limited because the federal government put that 10-person mandate piece in and those types of things. And granted, now I made the mistake just now, not mandate, but guidelines. And people have to realize these were always guidelines. The churches could have continued to meet, but they were afraid to meet because they were going to be the one that was labeled as the person who killed people. They were the ones who met and killed people. And that's where we as citizens have to stand up for our freedoms and liberties, and we have to be careful and make sure that words mean something. So in the executive order side, I think it's really important. Every state has to try get in there that 30-day, 25-day, whatever it's going to work for your state. What's interesting is North Dakota had 30-day. They moved to remove it, and in 85 they removed it, so now we don't have that. The other problem we have in North Dakota is our Constitution says you meet for up to 80 days every 2 years. Well, if the legislature doesn't have enough days to call themselves in to recall the executive order, they have to wait for the governor to call them in on special session. Now, would our governor call the legislature in to have a special session to remove his executive orders? Doesn't make sense, right? So our legislative branch is really in a tight spot because they only have, I think it's 4 days right now. They can't get in, get the work done, and get out. So they can't even go do that, let alone they go in and 2 days later, he puts the executive order back on, and now they have no days to get in. So that's a constitutional change that we're going to have to make. And I'm sure that other legislative bodies kind of have those types of guidelines. So there really should be looking with, we're working with legislative counsel to address more legislative control on all of this. Fortunately, our governor has been working with leadership all along. He has met with the leadership at least once a week, trying to make sure they know what he's doing. Now, is he taking all their recommendations? I wouldn't know for sure, but so that bond, that relationship between executive and legislative really needs to be strong. It's sad when you have a state such as our a state next to us in Minnesota where it's a split legislature, a governor who's trying to control things. But yeah, these issues really need to be addressed, and I think every legislative branch needs to be looking at it to get it ready.
Thanks, Bette.
Yeah.
Thanks, Bette. Here's a question, and I'll take some of it, and I'd be curious to see what Paul has to say about it as well. It's from Greg Hertz. Should the restrictions, shutdowns, health orders, etc., be made by non-elected officials And if they are, should an elected body have some sort of veto power over these rules and shut down orders? And I'll lead off the answer by saying, that's our whole thrust for today, is that we do want to put elected officials back involved in the process. Not so much the governors. We understand, I think we can all accept that the governors have a role in the process. But what we want to do is claw back and provide legislators the type of research and legislative language to claw back some of their input and their rulemaking processes, to ensure that it's not one person that is making these decisions for 8 million people, 50 million people. In North Dakota's case, the 500,000 people, whatever the case may be, however large your state is, it is not appropriate, in my opinion, and I think in nearly every legislator's opinion, that one person have that type of authority. But I'd be curious to know the role of, say, science and public health officials in this process. If you guys have thoughts, Paul?
Yeah, thanks, Cameron. I agree. Again, a decision like this has to be kind of based in an individual that's an elected position. There's got to be someone who makes the final choice, but can move forward on it. One of the things I want to keep in mind is the emergency orders are important to be able to have. And we should be able to have a situation like you're saying, 30 days, Wisconsin is 60 days. The governor should have that flexibility to initiate, but he needs to be able to come back and get confirmation and reassurance that this is what's going to happen. I think what we saw happening here is we put the onus on the Department of Health Services to guide us through this pandemic. And if you're, depending on what drives you crazy or what makes you excited, if you're an epidemiologist, to have an unknown virus and to see how it impacts the entire state, this is awesome. I can direct this whole thing. We can tell people what we want to do. We're not doing it for the sake of the economy or the people. We're doing it because we want to see how this virus impacts. That's the challenge that you have when you start putting decisions like this, long-term decisions, into appointed positions that have no recourse that we can go back at. I think that's what you saw with the Supreme Court here. I will tell you, my public health director is an incredible individual. They're dynamic, but they kind of geek out at times, and we've talked about it, over the science. And it was great for him. He's relatively new. He's been around for about 6 months now. He was the second in command there. But he came into me probably 3 weeks into this and said, okay, I need to understand the politics of why you're looking at things. And when we can start discussing that, all of a sudden it's like, okay, here's why I want to do this. Why do you want to do it this way? Okay, let's figure out how we're going to get it done. And as soon as that happened, Ben has been very responsive. And at the same time, he understands, one of the things we're talking about right now are college or high school graduations. People want to have some closure in their high school life. How can we get this done? A public health director in another county said, you can't do it. There's just no way we could bring these people together. And Ben has come to me and said, okay, how can I work with the school districts to figure out a plan that we can work within? That's the big difference. And I think that's, Karen, when you're saying, instead of saying freeze out the emergency orders, having that clawback, having that moment that you have to come back and check in Wisconsin with 33 senators and 99 representatives to justify the pathway that we're moving forward on is important. If it's not done, in this case, they just kind of jumped around it and said, this is what we're going to do. You saw what happened. Those, I think, are the keys. If I were, again, as I said, if I were back in the legislature, that's what I'd be working on right now, is how do we ensure that we have to come back and you have to report out to us, and you've got to show the metrics. They keep talking about the plans, but they've never adjusted what data they're utilizing. make them responsible just like everybody else is to it, and make them respond to the elected officials the way they should.
All right, thanks, Paul. All right, it's a few minutes after 3, so I'm going to wind this down. I want to first thank everybody for being on the call. County Executive Farrow, former Representative Bette Grandi, thank you. Rick, who had to drop off the call, thank you to him. A couple house cleaning things. One, if you have questions we didn't get to, please email those to me, and I'll put my email address. Well, most of you have my email address. Email your follow-up questions to me, and I will make sure we get good answers to that. Secondly, for the Legislative Forum members and any other legislators that are on this call, we will be following up with you separately after this and start talking about your individual statutes and how we can get those tightened up. We'll be doing the research. We're going to come with binders and research and ideas, and we're going to help you work through this process if you're interested. So look for that in the next coming weeks. So with that, any questions, let me know after we get off the call here today. Thank you to everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day. Stay safe, and look forward to the next one. Thank you.